Hi, and if you're listening to this is TechKnowledge, a podcast where your host, me, Heath Peck,
And me, Aaron Redmond.
will pick a topic that's pretty relevant in the technology industry, and we'll give you our thoughts on it. Our opinions, what we like, dislike, and what our experience with this technology is. And to give a little bit of background about us is we're essentially just software developers for an enterprise level company, and we just work day to day with developing web applications. So let's get into it. This is episode 1, and our first topic is going to be TypeScript. So, what is TypeScript? That would be the first question we can answer. And at a very, very high level, TypeScript is essentially just a JavaScript compiler. At the end of the day, anything you write in TypeScript will just be turned into JavaScript. I mean, is that wrong to assume here, Aaron?
No, I think that's exactly right. And it's, beyond that, it's like a superset of the JavaScript language, right?
Yeah. I like to call it like JavaScript plus. Like you get JavaScript, plain JavaScript, plus all of these other features that exist inside of TypeScript.
hmm
So why would you use TypeScript over JavaScript? Well, TypeScript has a bunch of benefits to it that don't exist just in JavaScript. One of the key features there is types, as the name states, TypeScript. You can type out objects, functions, everything. Like you can give it a definite type. What is this function going to take as a parameter? What is this function going to return? It makes it feel a little bit more like a strictly typed language. I mean, that's what it is. TypeScript is a strictly typed language.
Right.
So what you can do is it helps you create this code that you know what it's going to do. You know what parameters it's going to take. You know what it's going to return. What those types of those parameters are going to be, and it lets you work a little bit easier because you have all these JavaScript functions that are taking random arrays, and then you're mapping through these arrays, and you're indexing an object that somebody decided to call O, and you're mapping through O dot property, where it equals this. And I'm like, well, what's O? What property is it? What other properties are there? What is being done to manipulate this data? But if you're using TypeScript, you can go ahead and know what that O is. You know that this is always going to be an array of this type of object, and that whole object is already typed out. So that that gives you one of the other benefits of TypeScript is it's really well supported by IDEs, and your IDE is going to know what that object you're passing as parameter is. You can autocomplete on that object. You can know all of the potential functions you can access on a class. It's really useful for just as you get into it for just day-to-day coding, your day-to-day life.
Right. As long as you've taken the time to, you know, set up the structure of that object. Anytime you use it again and you try to access a property of that object, it's going to tell you like, oh, well, these are the properties that exist. This is what you
Yeah,
can use. And it's going to give
exactly.
you that safety too. If you try to, take a number
Yeah,
where,
that's
or,
it. That's the key right there. Is most people like safety. Most people say
yeah,
the number one benefit of TypeScript is type safety. You know what you're
hmm
working with. It
yeah,
eliminates a lot of like potential runtime errors because you know you're never going to index or access some property that's undefined
right,
because TypeScript will be like, there's a chance this is undefined, null, or it's not the correct thing. You're trying to perform a string manipulation on something that's an object. TypeScript will know these things if you type out everything beforehand. And it's quite useful to prevent these runtime errors, especially if you're working with something, you're coding on it for a couple days. You make a PR, it gets merged, and then it gets deployed into some staging environment, and then it throws a runtime error. Now, to be fair, you should have caught that locally. You should have written better code, as they say. But TypeScript's not going to let you do that. TypeScript's not going to compile. The compiler's going to yell at you if you are doing these things that are just like essentially wrong. So it gives you that type safety. That's one of the main benefits of TypeScript. Also, TypeScript's one of the other benefits is you have access to features that just don't really exist in JavaScript, and if they do, they're brand new, such as like classes and interfaces. And like classes have kind of been around for a while, but not in the same sense of like how they were written and how they're structured. But in TypeScript, you can write a strictly typed language. You can write stuff that feels like Java. You can write a class and an interface and classes that inherit and instantiate these classes and interfaces. You can, if you want to do a little bit more object-oriented programming, like let's say you're writing like a game that inherits all of these things where, you're writing a plane and then you have like a type of a plane. You can do that in TypeScript.
cat extends animal, right?
Exactly. You can do the old classic. If anyone is familiar with like C# and Java, you can do the classic like uh, what is it, the farm. Like you can make a farm where you have, on that farm you have an animal, and then you have all these types of animals. Exactly. Also, you don't have to use them. Like if that's what I'm saying, you can be a very like object oriented type of programmer if that's like your background, if that's what you feel suits you. You can also be a very functional type of programmer. You don't have to you don't have to manipulate data. You don't have to instantiate classes. You don't have to do that ever if you don't want to. It really just depends on the team you're working with, what y'all decide is your standard, what y'all decide is your strengths, your weaknesses, and what you think you should be doing.
Right. You get that. You get your TS config file, which tells the compiler how you want things, like how you can tell it how strict you want the type check to be, for instance, or don't let me declare a variable and not use it.
Yep.
Or these different kinds of things that are going to throw errors or not throw errors and make you not compile based on the settings that you set up, and you can be as strict as you want.
Exactly. Another benefit of TypeScript is that it gives you access to all of the brand new features in JavaScript. So part of like TypeScript's goal is that it supports the newest JavaScript features of like the ES standards. So what you can do is you can write JavaScript, quote unquote, but TypeScript in the new syntax of JavaScript, the newest like latest code. So from ES 2019 or 2020, not entirely sure. You can use like flat map, and then now 2020 you can use like nullish coalescence and optional chaining and all of these like brand new features. But if you're targeting a website that doesn't support those brand new features yet, because you're using it in an older browser, or you're stuck on a certain version of something, you set your target for TypeScript to compile down to an older version of JavaScript, and it'll turn those newer features into the same syntax as it would have been if you'd written it in older JavaScript. It allows you to use new features and write cleaner code with these new features that still works. It's cross-compatible across older browsers.
Yeah, it kind of works like Babel in that way. If you're familiar with the whole Webpack Babel setup,
Yep.
it's going to transpile your code to the version of JavaScript that you're targeting.
Yep, absolutely. And it's really useful because you can write, what's that saying? It's write once, use everywhere. You can write one version of TypeScript that you can, in theory, you could have work in all browsers, on all web pages now. Nothing's quite that simple at the end of the day, but that's the practice. That's
Right.
that's the goal, what you want to do with TypeScript. I mean, and there's always a couple other benefits of TypeScript. There's some that I know we personally, or at least I personally, haven't been using much. There's module support for TypeScript, so you can write modules that these functions only exist in these modules, and then you can import them and use them almost, as if you're writing modules for Node and NPM, if people are familiar with that. And there's like this sense of comfortability. Like if we've kind of already touched on it, but you can slowly adjust to TypeScript if you're working with JavaScript. You can like adjust your TS config settings to where you can write plain JavaScript, and it's still like you can write a JavaScript function plain, no types, in a TypeScript file, .ts file, and as long as you have TypeScript config to not yell at you, it'll be fine. At the end of the day, it is just JavaScript. So then
Right.
what you can do is you can slowly come back and add types, and then create interfaces or whatever you want to do to make this better code, to make it more clean, more understandable, easier to use. Make your
Yeah.
life and everyone else's lives easier.
And that can be helpful when you're on a large team, right? And you don't necessarily, and with a large code base too, you don't necessarily want to do it all in one day. Maybe you want to take an incremental approach.
Exactly, because especially you're saving yourself, future you, time and energy, and future new developer time and energy. Because
Hmm.
when you walk into a code base that's thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of lines long, and it's very abstract and you don't know exactly what's going on, it certainly would help if you at least knew what properties are being passed in functions. You can read the name of a function and have no idea what it does, because what data is it taking? Is it taking an object of objects? Is it taking a singular object? Is it taking an array of objects, an array of strings? What is it returning? Does it always return something? Should it never return something? Does it just call another API? All of these things, but you can set that structure up in TypeScript to help you and everyone else know exactly what's going to happen, and that's just one of the main benefits of it. Now, that being said, TypeScript has some drawbacks. I mean, there's there's pluses and minuses to everything, and TypeScript is and TypeScript is no exception. So one of the main probably complaints that I would imagine from trying to start using TypeScript is that probably has a bit of a learning curve if you only worked in one type of programming. Like if you were only an object-oriented programmer, if you were only a strict hard JavaScript developer, or if you're just coming from nowhere and you're trying to learn JavaScript and you're writing it with a company or whatever and you want to do it in TypeScript, but you're only looking up things about JavaScript, and then you have to set up a TS config. There's a little bit of overhead, initial time to figure out how to set everything up. So with setting up a TS config, there is a lot of support out there. Like the TypeScript documentation is super useful. It's super in depth. There's a lot you can do. And when you make a TS config, which is just essentially just the settings for how TypeScript transpiles your TS down to JS. Setting that up initially could be a little bit difficult, but also it can be pretty straightforward. If you don't want to have too much control over it and you just want to use a very generic, simple setup because you're just making a small project for right now, the initial default TS config will just work. And then as you get into, you're like, I don't really want it to be this strict, or I want to change a little bit about this. You can adjust your TS config file. And that could be another topic. You could have a really simple TS config file and then just in place linting rules and all of this to change your code base. But that's a different topic. You can do all of this with just TypeScript.
Yeah, and you can get that default TS config from the TypeScript docs, and you can just roll with that for as long as you want, really, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it's just like when you realize you need to change something, you can come back and change it. It just, there is that just a little bit of initial, it's another thing. If you're writing something in JavaScript and now you got to have a TS config as well, it's just a little bit of initial overhead.
Yeah, and I mean, every time I talk to one of my friends or coworkers that works exclusively in JavaScript, and I say, I ask them oh, do you use TypeScript or do you plan to use TypeScript? They always kind of give me this look and they go, I don't know, because, they're used to doing things a certain way and they're used to having all this kind of freedom, unbounded freedom of writing in JavaScript. You don't really have to worry about things. And yeah, you get some bugs sometimes, but I think once, at least the people that I've talked to, once they start using it, and myself included, because I felt the same way, once I started using it and once I got comfortable with it, it's hard to go back because you're like, well, I have all this built-in safety, and my code has essentially, in some cases, self-documented itself by typing out all these objects, and I know what's going on. So I think people initially can be, at least in my experience, a little hesitant to start it. But, once you've gone on that TypeScript train, it's kind of hard to get off.
Yeah, and that's the whole benefit we were talking about, was where you can slowly adjust to it. You can write plain JavaScript, and then you can slowly, let's say you adding parameter types, and then you're adding return types, and then you're defining the structure of the objects that you're passing. Like you can slowly add this into. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. It's not black and white. You can slowly, gradually turn a project from a JavaScript project to a TypeScript project. You can have them work together if you want.
For sure. You could start by just typing everything to any if you want.
Yep.
Just the any generic any type. It could be anything. But at least it has a type. Exactly.
Yep. So one of the other downsides is if you're trying to implement TypeScript or turn a JavaScript project into TypeScript, or a team that uses just plain JS into TypeScript, there is that just initial challenge of trying to convince everyone it's worth it, that this little bit of overhead. But I'm telling you, once you get everyone on board with it, it will save time. It'll pay off dividends. It'll save you time, 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, for the rest of the time you're working on that project. You just have to convince, everyone on the business side that it's worth it. I don't even know if we talked about another one of the main benefits of it is TypeScript. This is not a necessarily part of TypeScript, but writing these definite types, these objects and these functions that exactly what the structure is, it makes you into a better developer. It makes you into a developer that wants to write better code, that wants to be more verbose. You want to explicitly name things. You want to be very clear about what you're doing. And it just starts to save you and everyone else time. And it makes it easier to get your PRs approved, because when people are looking at your code, they know what it's doing without having to spend an hour trying to map through it in their head. What is this doing? What data is he manipulating here? What is he getting in?
Right, and ideally you're all using the same TS config, right? So they at least have a base level confidence in your code that it passed those
Exactly. It helps you. The other part of that same thing is if you're all using the same thing, all using the same structure, especially if you're trying to get people to work with the same code base as you, and you start structuring out these types and these functions and maybe classes if you're doing class-based programming, is that they all know what you're working with. They can go see it. It's in their code. It's in their local branch. Their IDE will support what it is. I mean, if they just wanted to look at it, they're like, oh, it's this object that has these 3 types on it that are all strings. It's just helpful. And I can't get over like the fact of how much of a better developer it makes you when you want to be clear about what you're working with, what you're doing. So as far as I guess our personal experience with TypeScript is we came into a code base that was all TypeScript, or what we thought was TypeScript. And then when you get to the code was all JavaScript. And we're going through this never-ending process right now of doing what we're talking about, of taking essentially JavaScript and turning it into TypeScript and using it, in a way that makes it easier. And so these opinions that we have are coming from the past, couple months of us turning a TypeScript project that is actually just JavaScript into a TypeScript project. And it just makes it easier to work with.
Right.
So the initial, 6 hours it took me to refactor something, I could probably, refactor it. I could have refactored it in 1 hour had I known what everything I was working with was.
Yeah, and as you go, you kind of refactor it. You include more TypeScript, like idioms of the language.
Exactly.
And you use it to its advantage.
Oh, that's probably, we should probably throw this on the, it's probably part of the overhead of learning TypeScript. There is a little bit of syntactical issues you could run into. Sometimes like object destructuring could look like you're declaring a new TypeScript type, or vice versa. TypeScript types kind of look like you're declaring a new object sometimes. It just depends on how everything's set up. And that's just another little quirk about TypeScript and how you use it. And once you do that in a little bit, a couple times, you're like, oh, why did this not work? It looks like, somebody's just made this type right here, and they're actually just destructuring and renaming a property of some other object. You just console log it, and you're like, wow, it's really this simple. And then you only have to do that once, and then you know exactly what's going on from there on out. I guess you can see that our opinions are definitely pro TypeScript, and we probably couldn't, for any of the negatives there, we probably couldn't praise it anymore. So.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you're weighing it in our situation where we're working with a large team and a large code base, having that safety, that kind of guardrail is just invaluable, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, just saving yourself, everyone else time, saving runtime errors, all of this benefit definitely outweighs any initial cost or any initial time to get set up.
Definitely.
All right. Well, that's episode 1 from us at TechKnowledge, TypeScript. And we'll leave a couple of useful links in the description below. And see you next episode.